The most powerful mafia boss in the city lived in total darkness, believed to be born blind, until a new maid noticed a microscopic glint on his eyelid and realized his disability was actually a 30-year-old crime. With one steady hand, she removed the surgical shroud, shattering his silence and revealing a world of color and a house full of traitors. Stay tuned because the first thing he sees is the one person who's been lying to him since the day he was born. Han Seo-jin was the blind king of the city, a man who ruled a criminal empire through sound and shadow. For 32 years, his inner circle told him his darkness was a tragic act of God, but they were lying. While the world's best doctors saw nothing, his new maid, Ada, noticed a tiny artificial shimmer beneath his lash. In a moment of pure nerves, she did the unthinkable. She touched the untouchable boss and pulled a microscopic veil from his eye. Now, for the first time, Seo-jin can see. He's keeping his glasses on and his cane in hand because the only way to survive a house full of traitors is to let them believe he's still in the dark. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a black lacquered cane echoed through the marble halls of the Han estate, a sound that acted as the heartbeat for the house. To the world, Han Seo-jin was the king of shadows, a man who ruled the city's most lucrative shipping lanes and darkest alleyways without ever having seen them. He walked with a chilling, predatory grace, moving through the labyrinthine corridors with a confidence that defied his sightless eyes. His world was constructed of textures, temperatures, and the specific cadence of footsteps. He knew the heavy, nervous gait of his bodyguards and the light, clicking heels of the secretaries who brought him documents to sign in Braille. His mother, Madame Han, had spent 3 decades perfecting this ecosystem. She was the architect of his reality, the eyes of the syndicate who stood at his right hand, whispering descriptions of faces and handshakes into his ear like a dark lullaby. Under her guidance, Seo-jin's rule was absolute. He was a man who couldn't be fooled by a visual mask because he judged men by the sweat on their palms and the tremor in their voices. On this morning, the air in his study smelled of expensive cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of his mother's favorite perfume. "The council is waiting, Seo-jin," she murmured, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "Remember, they look to you for strength, but they look to me for the truth. Keep your glasses dark and your heart colder." Seo-jin adjusted the obsidian black lenses that shielded his eyes, a permanent barrier between him and a world he had never known. He allowed his mother to lead him toward the heavy oak doors, her grip firm, almost too firm. To any outsider, it was a touching display of maternal devotion, a mother navigating for her vulnerable son. But to Seo-jin, it was the only life he had ever known. He was the most feared man in the country, a wolf who had mastered the art of hunting in the dark, yet he remained tethered to his mother's side like a child. As they entered the boardroom, the room fell into a suffocating silence. The blind king took his seat at the head of the table, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the mahogany wood. He didn't need sight to feel the fear radiating from the men around him. He ruled through the myth of his own invincibility, a man who had turned a disability into a weapon of mystery. Little did he know, as he sat in that familiar darkness, that the perfect system his mother had built was about to be dismantled by a single, observant glance from a girl who was supposed to be invisible. Ada Martins kept her head down, her movements as fluid and silent as the shadows she was hired to clean. In the Han estate, the staff were treated like pieces of furniture, functional, necessary, and ideally mute. As she polished the silver trays in the grand library, she kept her ears open, hearing the distant, rhythmic strike of a cane against stone. It was a sound that sent a ripple of tension through the other servants, but for Ada, it sparked a quiet, dangerous curiosity. She had been told the rules on her first hour: never speak unless spoken to, never stand in the boss's direct path, and above all, never look him in the eye. They said Han Seo-jin's blindness had sharpened his other senses to a supernatural degree. that he could hear a heartbeat change from across a room. Ada, who had grown up at the feet of her grandfather, a man steeped in the old ways of traditional medicine and ocular anatomy, knew that the body rarely kept secrets from those who knew how to look. The heavy doors creaked open, and Seoljin entered, guided not by a hand, but by the sheer memory of the room's dimensions. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face a mask of sculpted granite, his eyes hidden behind those signature obsidian glasses. Ada approached to set a glass of water on the side table, her breath catching as she drew within the radius of his presence. He smelled of rain and cold iron. As she leaned in, a stray beam of morning sunlight cut across the room, hitting the side of his face. For a fleeting second, Seoljin tilted his head toward the warmth, and his glasses slipped a fraction of an inch down the bridge of his nose. Ada froze. She didn't turn away. Instead, she looked, really looked. Most people saw the milky white film of a blind man's stare, but Ada saw something else. Right at the edge of his iris, nestled under the fold of his upper eyelid, was a microscopic, translucent shimmer. It wasn't the dullness of a cataract or the scarring of an injury. It was a glint, unnatural, geometric, and perfectly placed. It looked like a surgical shroud, a thin membrane designed not to heal, but to obstruct. Her heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was certain he could hear it. This wasn't a biological tragedy, it was a masterpiece of deception. Someone had purposefully dimmed the lights on the most powerful man in the city. As Seoljin sensed her lingering presence, his brow furrowed and his sightless gaze turned toward her. Ada realized in that moment that she was no longer just a maid. She was the only person in the world who knew the King of Shadows was living in a manufactured cage. The incense in the prayer hall always smelled of cold ash and secrets. Seoljin stood by the altar, his fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the mahogany wood. He moved with a practiced, fluid uncertainty, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the physical world. To any observer, he was the picture of a man adrift in darkness, a vessel waiting for a light that would never come. The heavy oak doors creaked open, but it wasn't the rhythmic step of a monk that echoed through the stone chamber. It was the sharp, confident click of Ada's heels. She didn't stop at the threshold. She moved toward him until the air between them grew heavy with her scent, jasmine and something metallic, like a blade hidden in a bouquet. "The act is exhausting, isn't it?" Her voice sliced through the silence, devoid of the reverence usually reserved for this room. Seoljin didn't flinch, though his pulse thrummed against his throat. "I don't know what you mean, Ada. The shadows are the same today as they were yesterday." He felt her move closer, so near that he could feel the radiating warmth of her skin. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from his face. Seoljin kept his gaze deadened, staring through her, a master of his own internal void. But Ada was a predator who could sense the subtle tension in a muscle. "You see me," she whispered, her breath ghosting over his cheek. "You see the way the light catches the dust in this room. You see the fear in the acolyte's eyes. Your blindness is a masterpiece, Seoljin, but even the best art has a flaw." She leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of his ear. "It's a lie, a beautiful, tragic lie you've used to shield yourself from the weight of your crown." Seoljin's hand tightened on the altar. "My sight was taken by the heavens. It is not a choice." Ada laughed, a low, melodic sound that felt like a threat. She reached out and took his hand, forcing his palm flat against her own. Her skin was electric, a forbidden contact that sent a jolt through his carefully constructed resolve. "God didn't break you, Seoljin. You broke yourself to survive," she said, her voice dropping to a seductive purr. "And because I am the only one who knows the truth, I am the only one who can fix it. I can give you back the world you've been pretending to miss. I can make the lie a reality, or I can burn the veil away entirely. She stepped into his personal space, her body a soft pressure against his chest. What would happen to the saint if he were suddenly cured by a sinner? The silence in the hall was no longer empty, it was pressurized, a physical weight that pressed against Seo Jin's chest as Ada's fingers moved toward the silk binding his eyes. For years, the ocular shrouds had been his armor, a physical barrier between his secret and the world's scrutiny. To remove them was to strip him of his sanctuary. "Don't move," Ada commanded, her voice a velvet friction. She reached behind his head, her knuckles grazing the nape of his neck. The knot gave way with a soft, sliding hiss of fabric. Seo Jin's breath hitched, his eyelids fluttering instinctively against the sudden vulnerability. He felt the weight of the silk fall away, sliding down his shoulders like a shed skin. He didn't open his eyes immediately. He couldn't. The darkness behind his lids was safe, a known country he had inhabited since the accident. But Ada was impatient with his hesitation. She cupped his jaw, her thumbs tracing the bone with a possessive rhythm that forced his face upward. "Open them, Seo Jin," she whispered. "Look at the ruin you've made of your life." He drew a jagged breath and let his lashes part. At first, there was only the familiar, muddy gray, the static of a mind conditioned to see nothing. But then, as if a guttering candle had been brought into a cavern, the world fractured. It began as a needle prick of white, sharp and agonizingly bright, stabbing through the center of his vision. He gasped, his hand flying up to catch her wrist, his grip bruising. The 30 seconds that followed felt like an epic. The blur of the prayer hall began to resolve into jagged shapes and shifting hues. The deep, bruised purple of the hanging tapestries bled into the gold of the altar's filigree. It was a chaotic symphony of light that his brain had forgotten how to conduct. And then there was her. Ada was no longer just a scent or a voice. She was a terrifyingly vivid reality. He saw the amber flecks in her irises and the triumphant, cruel curve of her mouth. The light caught the stray hairs at her temple, turning them into threads of spun copper. For the first time in years, the phantom images in his head matched the world in front of him. The spark of light didn't just illuminate the room, it scorched his soul. He saw the truth reflected in her eyes, that he was no longer a saint in hiding, but a man caught in a snare. "Here," she breathed, watching his. The world did not return to Seo Jin in a gentle dawn. It arrived like a physical assault. The colors were too loud, screaming at him from every corner of the stone hall. The deep crimson of the prayer rugs looked like fresh arterial spray against the floor, and the flickering candlelight felt like needles of molten gold pressing against his retinas. He stumbled back, his boots scuffing the floor as he fought the urge to retch. His brain, long accustomed to the muted gray safety of his own mind, was failing to process the sudden deluge of data. In his panic, he looked down at his own hands and froze. For the first time, he saw the ink. The intricate, serpentine tattoos that coiled around his forearms and disappeared beneath his sleeves were not abstract concepts he had felt under his fingertips. They were vivid, midnight blue scars of his past, twisting like living shadows against his pale skin. They looked like chains. They looked like warnings. To see them was to acknowledge the man he had been before the shroud, a man who had spilled blood long before he had ever sought a blessing. "Close your eyes if it's too much," Ada said, though her tone held no pity. She was watching him like a scientist observing a volatile reaction. He ignored her, his head whipping toward the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor. The heavy doors swung open and the sanctuary was invaded by the high-ranking ministers of the temple. These were the men who had knelt at his feet for years, whispering their sins into his blind ears. Seeing them was a fresh horror. He had imagined them as stoic, weathered pillars of faith. Instead, he saw the bloated, gluttonous curve of Minister Juan's neck and the calculating, predatory gleam in Elder Doe's narrow eyes. Their faces were maps of greed and hidden malice, etched with the very vices they preached against. They weren't holy men, they were vultures in silk robes. The sight of them made the air in the room feel thick and toxic. Seojin's vision blurred as a wave of vertigo washed over him. The red of the carpets, the blue of his ink, and the sickly pale flesh of his enemies swirled into a nauseating kaleidoscope. He realized then that the darkness hadn't just been a shield for his secret, it had been a shield for his sanity. The world was not beautiful. It was a visceral, pulsing mess of color and blood, and there was no way to unsee the rot that sat at the heart of his temple. He caught his reflection in a polished bronze shield mounted on the wall. The man staring back was a stranger, eyes wide, pupils blown, looking less like a saint and more like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt. The sensory riot threatened to pull the floor from beneath him, but as the ministers drew closer, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over Seojin's panic. He watched Minister Juan exchange a sharp, secretive glance with Elder Doe, a silent communication of power and shared secrets that they would never have dared in the presence of a sighted man. In that fraction of a second, Seojin understood that his vision was more than a sensory gift. It was a weapon of espionage. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the dark, high-rimmed glasses resting on the altar. As the frames slid onto the bridge of his nose, the world's aggressive brilliance was instantly tamed. The garish reds and stinging golds retreated behind the tinted lenses, returning him to a familiar, artificial twilight. To the approaching men, he was simply the sightless saint adjusting his veil. To Seojin, the glasses were now the glass of a sniper's scope. "High Priest," Minister Juan's voice boomed, oily and thick with false reverence. "The preparations for the solstice are underway. We require your blessing on the ledger of offerings." Seojin turned his head toward the voice, but he didn't aim his gaze directly at Juan's eyes. He angled his chin slightly to the left, mimicking the slightly off-center focus of the blind. Behind the dark lenses, however, his eyes were sharp and predatory. He saw Juan slide a heavy, leather-bound book onto the table, his fingers nervously drumming against a page that had been crudely altered. He saw the way Elder Doe's strand hovered near a concealed dagger in his belt, a habit of a man who lived in constant fear of betrayal. They felt safe in his presence. They spoke with their bodies, their hands, and their eyes, believing the man before them was locked in a sensory prison. "The light feels heavy today," Seojin murmured, his voice a low, melodic rasp. He felt Ada's presence behind him, a silent witness to his pivot. He could practically feel her smirk. He realized then that to heal openly would be to commit suicide. If he revealed his sight, he would become just another rival to be eliminated. But as a blind man, he was a confessional. He was the ghost in the room that everyone ignored while they plotted their treasons. The darkness was no longer his burden, it was his camouflage. "Proceed," Seojin said, his hidden eyes tracing the sweat on Juan's brow. "Tell me what you wish for me to see." The tea service sat between them, the porcelain rattling softly as his mother, the Dowager Empress, poured. Behind his dark glasses, Seojin watched the liquid hit the cup, a stream of amber that looked like liquid gold in the afternoon light. For years, he had lived by the sound of her voice, a melody of maternal warmth and regal poise. He had believed the softness in her tone was the one honest thing left in his world. "The border skirmishes are escalating, Seojin," she said, her voice a soothing balm of concern. "The council is restless. They fear a leader who cannot oversee the maps or the movement of troops. It breaks my heart to see you bear such a burden in the dark." He tilted his head, playing the role of the dutiful, grieving son, but through the tinted veil of his lenses, he saw the truth. As she spoke the words, "breaks my heart," her face did not reflect sorrow. The skin around her eyes didn't crinkle with empathy. Instead, her brow remained smooth, her expression a mask of cold, clinical detachment. When she mentioned his burden, a fleeting shadow of a sneer curled her upper lip. It was a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated contempt, the look of a woman staring at a broken tool she had no more use for. Seojin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. He watched her hand reach out to pat his, a gesture he had always found comforting. Now he saw the way her fingers hesitated, a split second of visible revulsion before she forced herself to touch him. She didn't see a son, she saw a defect. "I am managing, mother," he replied, his voice steady despite the roar of realization in his ears. The shadows have their own way of teaching strategy. She looked away then, her gaze wandering toward the window. In the privacy of her own thoughts, believing her son was trapped in a void, the mask slipped entirely. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes grew hard and sharp, flickering with a restless, hungry ambition. She looked toward the throne room doors with a hunger that made her beautiful faces appear haggard. He had spent years mourning the pain his blindness must have caused her. He had lived in guilt, thinking he was a disappointment she was too kind to acknowledge. Now he saw that her kindness was merely a performance, a tactical maneuver to keep him compliant while she steered the ship from the shadows. The betrayal was more blinding than the light had been. He sat perfectly still, a statue of a saint, watching the woman who had birthed him plot his irrelevance with every silent, hateful twitch of her mouth. The family clinic was a sterile sanctuary of white marble and the sharp, biting scent of antiseptic. Dr. Eris, a man who had served the royal line for 30 decades, greeted Seojin with the practiced gentleness of a father figure. Behind his dark glasses, Seojin's eyes were wide, scanning the room with a frantic, hidden intensity. He watched the way the sunlight hit the glass cabinets, turning the surgical instruments into slivers of silver ice. "Sit, my prince," Dr. Eris murmured, his voice a low hum of comfort. "The Dowager Empress is concerned that your ocular nerves are inflamed, a simple sedative rinse to ease the pressure, as we have done every month." Seojin sat, his heart a drum against his ribs. He watched the doctor turn his back, moving toward a small preparation table in the corner. In the past, Seojin would have listened to the clink of glass and the slosh of liquid, imagining it to be a healing balm. Now he saw the truth in high definition. Dr. Eris reached for a vial hidden behind a row of standard saline. It wasn't clear. It was a viscous, milky yellow. With a steady hand, the doctor drew the fluid into a long, fine-tipped needle. Seojin's breath caught. He watched as Eris tapped the side of the syringe, a single bead of the chemical quivering at the tip. Then he saw it, the label on the discarded vial. It wasn't a sedative. It was a caustic compound designed to induce temporary scarring of the cornea, a chemical shroud to ensure the blindness never truly lifted. His mother hadn't just been waiting for him to heal, she had been paying a craftsman to keep him broken. The doctor turned back, the needle held low against his thigh, his face a mask of grandfatherly concern. "Just a few drops, Seojin. Keep your eyes closed tight." Seojin watched the doctor's thumb move toward the plunger. He saw the slight tremor in the old man's hand, not from age, but from the weight of the sin he was about to commit. The betrayal tasted like copper in Seojin's mouth. He realized that every checkup for the last 3 years had been a re-sentencing, a deliberate darkening of his world orchestrated by the people he trusted most. As the doctor leaned in, the needle rising toward Seojin's face, the prince didn't flinch. He remained a perfect, unmoving statue of a blind man. But beneath the dark glasses, his eyes were fixed on the doctor's jugular, cold and calculating. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a witness to his own attempted murder. "Tell me, Eris," Seojin said, his voice dropping to a whisper that stopped the doctor's hand midair. "Does the medicine sting today, or is it just the guilt?" The banquet hall was a cathedral of excess, lit by 1,000 flickering tapestries of fire. The smell of roasted marrow and heavy wine hung in the air, thick enough to choke a lesser man. Seo-jin sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his dark glasses reflecting the dancing flames like twin voids. To the men and women seated around him, he was merely the centerpiece, a hollow idol who provided the spiritual cover for their greed. He kept his head bowed slightly, his chin resting in his hand in a pose of contemplative exhaustion. Behind the lenses, however, his eyes were a silent gale, sweeping across the faces of his inner circle. To his left, Minister Huan raised a silver chalice, his eyes darting toward Elder Do at the far end of the table. It was a subtle movement, a quick, rhythmic double blink. In reality, it was a toast. In reality, it was a signal. Seo-jin watched as Do responded by tapping 3 fingers against the stem of his wineglass. The shipment has arrived, the guards are bought. The betrayal was a silent language, a choreography of nods and shifted glances that had likely played out in front of him for years. He watched his mother, the Dowager Empress, sit with a grace that bordered on the divine. She didn't look at the others directly. Instead, she adjusted her heavy jade necklace, her thumb sliding over the central stone. It was the command to proceed. A captain of the guard leaned in to whisper in Huan's ear, his hand subtly flashing 2 fingers beneath the edge of the table. 2 hours until the coup. Seo-jin felt a dark, cold amusement blooming in his chest. They were so bold in their treachery, so confident in his helplessness, that they didn't even bother to hide the malice in their smiles. He saw the way Huan's eyes lingered on the throne, a predatory hunger in every line of his face. He saw the way his mother's gaze flickered toward his own throat, calculating how much longer she had to pretend to love the husk of the sun she had blinded. He reached for his own glass, his fingers finding it with the deliberate, slow precision of a man who relied on muscle memory. As he took a sip, he let his gaze linger on each of them in turn, a phantom stare they couldn't feel. They were dancing on the edge of a blade, unaware that the blind man had already sharpened it. "The wine is particularly bold tonight," Seo-jin remarked, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. The table went momentarily silent. Huan froze with a piece of pheasant halfway to his mouth. The dowager's thumb stopped its restless pacing over her jade. "Is it, my son?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "Yes," Seo-jin said, turning his hidden, razor-sharp eyes directly toward her. "It has the metallic tang of an ending. Don't you agree?" He watched the blood drain from Huan's cheeks and the sudden, panicked contraction of her pupils. They didn't know why they were afraid, but for the first time, the dark glasses felt like they were looking back. The gala's golden chandeliers flickered, a momentary tremor in the power grid that signaled the start of the end. Seo-jin stood at the center of the ballroom, the crystal glass in his hand catching the light as the heavy mahogany doors were barred from the outside. Across the room, Director Park stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of cold triumph, flanked by men drawing suppressed pistols from underneath their tuxedos. The first shot was meant to be the finale. It whistled through the air, aimed directly at Seo-jin's heart. As he moved to pivot, his glasses, the thin, wire-framed spectacles that had always served as his shield of calculated intellect, slipped from his bridge. Time seemed to decelerate into a thick, viscous syrup. The glasses tumbled toward the marble floor, and Seo-jin reached out. He didn't reach for the frames. He reached for the path of the lead. With a fluid, predatory grace that defied his reputation as a mere scholar, Seo-jin's hand snapped closed inches from his chest. There was no sound of impact, only the soft hiss of displaced air. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Director Park froze, his finger still trembling on the trigger. Seo-jin slowly opened his palm. The mangled slug dropped to the floor with a heavy metallic clink, rolling to a stop next to his fallen glasses. He didn't pick them up. For the first time, the world saw him clearly, not the refined CEO, but the ghost who had survived the hell they had only read about. His eyes, sharp and terrifyingly calm, locked onto Park's.
The betrayal he found there didn't spark anger, it sparked a cold, absolute clarity. "You always said I leaned too heavily on my vision," Seojin said, his voice a low, resonant blade that cut through the gasps of the crowd. He stepped forward, crushing his own glasses under the heel of his polished shoe. "But I've never needed them to see exactly who you are." Before the guards could recalibrate, Seojin moved. He was a blur of shadows and precision. He didn't use a weapon, he used the momentum of their own fear. Within seconds, the 3 men closest to him were on the ground, disarmed by strikes too fast for the human eye to track. He stopped an arm's length from Park, who was now stumbling back against the buffet table, his face pale. Seojin reached out, adjusting Park's silk tie with a terrifyingly gentle touch. "The coup ends here, Director. You didn't just miss the target, you missed the scale of the man you were trying to kill."